Welcome back to A Kitsune's Tale. I am always interested in any comments my readers might have, so please message, like, and subscribe. Chapter 4. The Hunt. I awoke to total darkness, confused and scared. The complete lack of sight prompted me to strain to hear outside the room. The sound of water trickling in the room beyond the curtain was immediate and alluring. I moved awkwardly toward the sound, unsure of what might be underfoot. I was surprised at the smoothness of the stone floor beneath my bare feet. It reminded me of my mother's polished marble counter in the kitchen, yet it was warm against my skin rather than the coolness I would normally associate with stone. When I drew back the curtains slowly, I was assaulted by the smell of flowers and what I could only later describe as rain before a storm. The dim light from the candles in the room allowed my vision to adjust without discomfort. To my amazement, it reminded me of a National Geographic picture of a rainforest. To the far right, there was a small waterfall that fed a tiny pool in the center of the room from which steam rolled across the surface. The air was unnaturally warm and damp. The walls were covered in vines cascading down from an overhang near the ceiling. Everywhere, a different assortment of colorful plants adorned the space. The floor was covered in the same sand as the floor in my rooms within the palace, except for the stone border that wound around the pool, along with a stone path leading into another room hidden by a wall of vines. The only light came from fires originating from small silver globes at different intervals. I cautiously made my way toward the concealed exit. When I parted the vines to peer through, I saw Pasha curled up on a mountain of colorful cushions. My host was obviously asleep. I ducked back into the room, not wanting to disturb her. I took a moment to investigate further. Beside the pool, I found a white towel along with a note. Enjoy the water. I find it comforting to relax and meditate on what I have learned from my quests. I saw no option but to wait for Pasha to wake from her sleep. Stripping out of my robe, I knelt beside the pool, gingerly testing the water with my fingers. It was much warmer than my shower, but tolerable. My experience so far led me to conclude that the Kitsune apparently enjoyed their hot baths. I stood and carefully stepped down into the pool, finding a ledge to sit. It reminded me of the hot tub at the community center back home. My thoughts drifted back to my earlier experience. I had not expected anything to happen. I had errantly thought Pasha had given me some meaningless task to get me out of the way. I would definitely have to ask her about the hunt the ghostly fox had mentioned. I was not sure, however, that I wanted to tell her about the name my grandmother had given me. I had thought it was only a pet name adults gave children, but now I was not so sure. There were many things about my grandmother I had not considered possible. Maybe the answers I was looking for were in Kayla's journal Ceiro had given me. I also considered asking the old ambassador about my grandmother. I was so lost in thought that I did not notice Pasha climbing into the pool until, "Good morning, child." I jumped, startled by the sudden interruption. "How did your quest go?" I blinked at the fox version of Pasha. I slid down into the pool self-consciously, leaving only my head exposed above the water as my red hair floated about like tendrils. Her fur moved with a mind of its own as it floated around her neck. "Why didn't you tell me what would happen?" Her ears swiveled forward in curiosity, and she gave me a toothy grin filled with rows of sharp canines. "How would I know that? Want to fill me in?" I stared at her accusingly. "How do you change like that? I mean, I saw the changes to my teeth and ears you mentioned yesterday, but I did not make those changes." Pasha took a moment to pull her head below the water to re-emerge completely human. Her long red hair extended down past her shoulders, floating across the surface of the water, much as mine did. I noticed the red tattoos that ran the length of her arms also extended up her neck to end just below her jaw. I had not noticed them yesterday under the curls of red hair that matched their color almost perfectly. Now that her hair was slicked down with water, they stood out in sharp contrast to her fair skin. Pasha smiled back at me. "You can see them because you are not controlling the change. Kitsune are born human enough until they start to use their powers," she explained. You can generally tell how powerful we are by the number of tails we have. Normally, our powers start to surface within a few years, but with you, someone has apparently locked them away for some reason or another. She tilted her head in thought. Maybe to hide you, as once the powers start to surface, they are very hard to conceal. To have done that took someone of immense power. Pasha shrugged dismissively. At any rate, whoever locked your powers away is either dead or has allowed them to surface. That still does not explain how I control the change. I listened as Pasha described the changes I would go through and the process of controlling them. To me, it sounded simple. All I had to do was consciously want to hide them, that the Kitsune form was our natural state. The ability to change was the only thing all Kitsune had in common, however. Each had their own powers depending on how powerful they were. The more common were the two-tailed Kitsune who were able to use illusion to frustrate their adversaries. The more powerful were those with 3 tails and could control real objects with the mind. Only a few had 4 tails and were able to control such things as the weather, create fire, or cast other small magics. Are there any with 5 tails? Pasha stopped her explanation to stare openly at me. I mean, are the 4 tails the most powerful of you? There are rumored to be those born with 5 tails, but they are said to be so rare that only 1 in a generation is born. Most are killed the moment they are discovered out of fear. The last war erupted over the discovery of one such Kitsune, she explained finally. But why? I asked. Pasha shot to her feet and left the pool. It is time to go. I have a business to run. I clambered out of the pool, grabbing my towel in pursuit. What? What did I say wrong? Pasha ignored my question, leaving me to dress. I could not imagine how my question had upset her. I followed Pasha to the market in silence. Proprietors were busy putting their wares out for sale, oblivious to the girl struggling to keep pace with the Kitsune. At the shop, Pasha began grabbing up piles of clothes to put out for viewing. Uncomfortably standing there, I began to help as best I could. Once everything was set up, Pasha called out to a young bakaneko who hurried over. I was placed in his charge with instructions that he was to escort me back to the palace. The young bakaneko led me as far as the palace gates, where I was taken into the care of the guards. A short time later, Fishra appeared to escort me back to the palace without comment. I left the attendant at the door of my room. Once inside, I stormed off to the sleeping pallet to throw myself down, crying in humiliation. I lay there drowning my tears in the soft blankets of silk when I heard someone clearing their throat. I chose to ignore the intruder until I heard retreating footsteps. I lay there listening for the door to close, but it never did. Frustrated, I gave up and went to investigate. I found Ceiro sitting in the common room. The old Hulijing sat patiently waiting with his hands folded in his lap. I apologize for the intrusion, but Fishra told me you might like someone to talk to. I resigned myself to one of the many cushions without comment. I hear you were outside the palace gates alone at night. Did you find what you were looking for? Again, I refused to answer. Let me guess. You were out in search of answers to questions you don't know how to ask? I only stared at my hands without looking up at him. The sight of my long, narrow nails only dismayed me more. I could see fine red hair covering my skin that I had not seen before. Kano was right in bringing you here, though I am not sure if he realizes it yet. Without your grandmother, your life in the human world would have become very complicated. My life is more complicated now than it ever was, I snapped. I was instantly sorry for the way I responded, but Ceiro calmly nodded in response. Things are happening to me that I do not understand. Look at me, I'm becoming a monster. I began to cry anew and buried my face in my hands to hide the tears streaming down my face. Ceiro waited until I was able to bring my crying under control. You are no more a monster than I. Yes, you are different than you were when you first came to us, but you are no monster. Kayla thought herself a monster as well, but she eventually came to terms with who she was. I looked back up at the elderly Hulijing. I met Kayla when I was sent here by my father. I came across her hiding in the cellar in the servants' quarter, much as I see you now. She was probably a few years younger than you are. Unlike her, you came here before the changes. When she was found by Kano's father, she had already undergone her changes and was nearly half crazed because of it. Ceiro crossed the room to sit beside me and wrapped an arm around my shoulder to pull me close. I did not know what to do when I found her as I have you. The only thing I could think of doing was to sit watching her. Truth be told, she fascinated me endlessly. Even more, I was intrigued with her tale of how she came to be here. She told me she had overheard her mother talking with a priest about her being some sort of demon. This priest had suggested that she be sent someplace to study her deformities, as he called them. I snuggled closer to Ceiro and began to shake uncontrollably as my tears soaked his robe. When she heard this, she ran away. She said she spent several days roaming the mountains near her home, trying to cope with the continued changes. It was not until a storm rolled in that terrified her enough that when she closed her eyes, it stopped, and she opened them to find herself in the same woods as you. That is when a hunting party found her and brought her here. He shook me gently enough for me to look up at him. You see, Kayla was no monster. She just did not understand what was happening to her, just as you do not yet understand. He gave me that odd smile that only Huli Jing could. I tried to return the smile for his sake. Kayla and I became fast, close friends after that. We were almost inseparable over the years until she vanished. Learning that you are of her blood lightens my heart to know nothing ill became of her when we could not find her. His mind seemed to wander as he averted his eyes to stare off into nothingness. He seemed sad when he looked back down at me. If you ever need someone to talk to, do not hesitate to find me. I will always be at your disposal. I leaned away to allow the old Huli Jing to stand. Just before he left, he stopped at the door. You have her eyes, you know? With that, he left. I sat watching the door, unsure as to what to do or think. The visit was unexpected. I never guessed that the ambassador knew my grandmother as well as he claimed. It was difficult imagining my grandmother fearing anything. I remembered her as being very quiet and determined most of the time. When she did speak, it was of wild stories. I enjoyed those moments as a small child, but until now, had thought of them as nothing more than made-up fantasies to entertain a child. Later that evening, I received an invitation to dine with Kano, but had politely refused. Dinner was brought to my apartment an hour later. It remained mostly untouched other than munching on the grapes provided. I sat in my study reading through my grandmother's journal. Most of it was about fears of her transformation. There were, of course, many entries about the trouble she and a much younger Ceiro had gotten into. Some of the stories were funny and nearly outlandish. Such was the entry about how they had managed to add some berries to the water that dyed the fur of anyone who encountered it purple. I began to skim ahead, looking for clues to my own changes. A crude drawing caught my eye. It looked like a drawing of a fox under two moons. Below were the words, "The Hunt." I flipped the page, hoping to find some explanation. Nothing. The next page was blank. I flipped back before the drawing. It only contained an entry about a meeting with a dignitary I cared nothing about. I threw the book down in frustration. You could have at least left me some clues, I said to the air. A quick glance at my candle revealed it was nearing its end. Lacking anything more to do, I retired to my bed for the night. Days went by as they did when I first arrived. Summons for dinner came every evening, but otherwise I was left to my own devices. I spent much of my time in the palace library reading the few books I could find about the Kitsune. By the end of the week, multiple volumes lay discarded on the old, heavy wooden table, worn smooth from centuries of use. When I was not in the library, Fishra showed me around the estate. However, the controlled tours quickly grew boring. I wanted to see more, learn more than I could find within dusty old books. I continually harassed my guide about taking me around the city without success. Eventually, Fishra was no longer needed to navigate the estate. I came across the Kitsune one afternoon overseeing a duel. The controlled fighting held a fascinating rhythm. It was a dance without music. Only the ringing of metal on metal set the tempo. It differed from my daily routine of exploration and dinners. I decided to return to watch the fighters daily to learn more about this dangerous sport. One day I sat watching when the Kitsune called a halt to the duel and motioned me over. I hesitantly obeyed. The two combatants watched from within their helms as I crossed the circle. I wondered what they were thinking of the interruption. The Kitsune studied me, and I studied him in turn. He was well built. The muscles on his arms bulged slightly when he crossed them. His jaw looked like he was chiseled from stone, his yellow eyes hard and calculating. The instructor wore a simple sleeveless green robe, but otherwise it appeared unremarkable in comparison to most of the more flamboyant attire I saw others wear. I stopped just out of arm's reach of the Kitsune and waited for him to speak. "Why do you come here every day?" His voice was deep and cold. I felt uncomfortable under his stoic gaze. Something in the way he stood with his arms crossed, glaring down at me, was intimidating. When no answer was forthcoming right away, his ears began to lay flat against his head. I asked a question. "Why do you come here every day distracting my students?" "I'm sorry. I did not mean to distract anyone. I only wanted to watch and learn." I glanced over at the two fighters nervously. I saw no reaction from them. "And what have you learned?" the teacher asked. I again looked over at the two fighters. There was still no response. That the bigger fighter tends to drop his left shoulder when he stabs with his sword. It leaves his head open. It also shortens his reach. My body shook under the other's scrutiny. He turned back to his students. "Positions. I want you to stand next to me, pup, and watch." I did as I was told. The teacher returned his attention to his students. "Begin." We watched in silence. The bigger fighter dropped his shoulder repeatedly with every thrust. When the teacher shouted for him to correct the move, his reach increased by several inches, allowing him to make contact more frequently. As he did, the smaller fighter started moving farther out of range to avoid the thrust. Each time he did, the other would have to step forward to regain the advantage. Suddenly, the smaller fighter turned aside from the thrust, twisted his wrist, and finished with a slash across his opponent's side before allowing his momentum to carry him back out of range. It was then that the teacher called an end to the duel. "That is enough for today. Get cleaned up." The two students bowed slightly at the waist before leaving. The teacher then turned his attention on me. "Come see me just after sunrise in the morning if you wish to learn. Tell any of the guards Kern told you to report and they will direct you to me." I smiled at the teacher. "You will not be smiling after tomorrow," he growled. The armory was not difficult to find. I did, however, get odd looks from the guards when asked for directions. I was unable to get much sleep the night before and had decided to leave early to meet with Kern. I sat against the wall on an old wooden stool out of the way. The armory was not what I had expected. The room contained the very basic necessities. The floor consisted of packed dirt well-traveled by years of use. It was also dirty and loud from the bellows that burned around the clock to keep the fires hot enough to work the metals. It was nothing compared to the immaculate palace. Across the room, a wet bakaneko hammered away at a bar of hot orange metal. The muscles on his arms bunched and flexed under the weight of his hammer with each blow. He would flip the bar after every strike, bending it over the edge of his anvil. Each time it became longer and slimmer. When it began to lose its color, he would place it into the oven to retrieve another. "You're early." I stood when Kern approached. "Come with me. You will be working with Kitsune. He will show you how to work the forge." Kern led me over to the bakaneko I had been observing for the past hour. "Master Kitsune, I have someone who wishes to learn the sword." Kitsune tossed the bar he had been working on and turned to size me up, before turning to Kern with his ears partially drawn back. "She's not big enough to lift a hammer. What am I supposed to do with her?" "Toughen her up. She may be small, but she was able to see a weakness in one of my students without any training." Kern patted the armorer on the shoulder. "If anyone can do it, you can, old friend." Kitsune only grunted. Once Kern was gone, he turned his attention to me. "You must have upset him greatly to be sent here for punishment." I was unsure how to answer, so I thought it was best not to try. Quiet one, eh? That's good. Let's see if you can operate the bellows. He showed me how to squeeze the handles together while explaining the process to me until he was sure I understood. I tried to do it as Kitsune had instructed, but lacked the required strength. After multiple attempts, I tried leaning against one side and using both hands to pull the other toward me. I struggled at first, but finally succeeded in squeezing the bellows. Kitsune lifted his ears slightly in response before leaving the room. I worked for what felt like hours. By the time Kitsune returned, my arms were exhausted. Rather than allowing me a break, he handed me a heavy metal hammer and instructed me on how he wanted me to strike the anvil. Once satisfied, he returned to working the metal bar. I was instantly aware of how noisy the room became. Each strike rang out in contrast to the other. I tried to keep pace despite the weakness in my arms to no avail. When I felt I could no longer continue, Kitsune ordered me to switch hands. He did not allow me to stop until he placed his piece back into the forge. I followed him outside into the cool breeze of the summer morning. Though I knew it was not as cool as it felt, it was much cooler than the sweltering armory. I sat when told to do so and was offered a plate of meat. When I did not take it, Kitsune dipped his ears in disapproval. "You must eat," he declared simply. "I can't lift my arms," I protested. "I have no strength left in them." Kitsune set the plate beside me along with a bowl of water. "Eat and go home when you can use your arms. Come back tomorrow." We sat in silence while the armorer ate. The rest of the week continued much the same as it had started. I woke every morning sore and stiff from the previous day's work. Kitsune would work me tirelessly throughout the morning in the forge until I could no longer use my arms. I was then sent to run errands after lunch. He also expected me to literally run while on my errands. When I was doing neither, he found me other tasks that kept me equally exhausted. In the evenings, I would soak in my shower to relieve the pain in muscles I never knew existed. Kern would stop by on occasion to observe me from a distance but never approached. I had even spotted Kano talking with Kitsune one afternoon when I had returned from one of my errands. Kano smiled at me but did not visit before he left. I sat in my study, too stiff to move. Kitsune had given me the day to spend as I chose. I sat unwilling to move when I heard someone knocking. "Come in." The door opened and Fishra's head appeared around the door. "Good morning," I greeted. Fishra stepped the rest of the way in. "I thought you might like to go to the festival. Today is the harvest festival. There will be all sorts of things to see or do." I scowled up at her. I was in no mood to go anywhere. "Don't give me that look. You need to get out and do more than subject your body to the torture of the forge." "It's not torture," I protested, as I was dragged reluctantly up out of my chair by my useless arm. There was not enough strength left in either to resist. "You come in every afternoon in so much pain that you can barely move. That looks like torture to me." She rummaged through my clothes until she found a pastel red robe she liked. "This should match your fur nicely." I stopped unfastening my worn pants to stare blankly at my hands. I had been so tired when I came home in the evening, I had failed to notice the changes that had been taking place. Even now, my mind refused to register the claws that replaced my hands. Fishra turned to see the hesitant look on my face. "Don't tell me you haven't noticed?" She grabbed my shirt to pull it off over my head to reveal the short, soft red fur. "Why do you think it took so long to get clean when you came home? It takes a lot of effort to get that soot off. Even now you smell of burnt wood and molten metal." She turned me around and pushed me toward the shower. By the time we reached the little room and the water flowed over me, I had managed to finish undressing. I stood there numb while Fishra worked the soap through the thickening fur at the same time as she used her own claws to work the knots out. "You have to let me brush this out. I wish my pelt was this soft." Once out of the shower, she began to brush my fur until it shone in the dim light of the room. I was then coaxed into a waiting pastel robe. It was not until the door was opened that I froze. "I can't go out like this. I look like some freak." I did not know Huli Jing could frown until that moment. She stood there with her jaw clenched tight and her tail perfectly still. I do not know what a freak is, but I am sure you are not one, growled Fishra. You look perfectly normal to me. Now stop acting like a stubborn child. She growled again when I refused to move. Instead of arguing further, she began to push me out the door and down the hall. Once outside, I allowed myself to be led through the streets under the scrutiny of several passers-by. Everyone in my mind looked our way as we continued. I was uneasily aware of how many of the shopkeepers stopped to stare. I was eventually led to a massive fire where those of every race danced and sang together beneath the sunset. The evening was filled with laughter and music. Drums beat out a steady, deep rhythm as flutes and other string instruments filled the space between. I watched in fascination as people danced around the roaring fire that leapt tens of feet into the air. The longer I watched, the less I thought about my own problems. I found myself swaying with the tune of someone playing what sounded like a flute. The dancers leapt and turned. Another dancer followed close behind, attempting to match pace and motion. Suddenly, the lead would stop while the other would circle around, making exaggerated movements as they did. The fire roared violently behind them, casting shadows throughout the crowd of onlookers. I thought I caught a glimpse of something familiar within the maelstrom. I was about to dismiss it when I saw it again. The more I concentrated, the more I felt drawn in. I marveled at the way the firefox intertwined itself around the flames. The heat caressed my skin as I unconsciously swept through the darkening flames. I followed closely behind the firefox on its journey deeper into the inferno. The longer my pursuit continued, the darker the flames became until it was nearly black as night, the embers flickering like stars in the distance around me. In the distance, I could hear someone calling my name among the growing noise. I chose to ignore it. I refused to be denied the hunt. Join me for more from Kitsune's tale. I hope you have enjoyed the story thus far. Please leave a comment below.